Seen that. Now, maybe I'm sure there's some person out there that happened for, but their brain was probably not wired the way the rest of the folks that smokes brains are. And remember too that I think these things, I think gambling, and sexual addiction, and food addiction. By the way, I didn't used to believe in sexual addiction, but it does sort of make sense that there might be people who it takes excessive amounts of sex or sexual activity or that kind of thing to light up their brain, where the rest of us it doesn't. And then that obviously with any of these disorders, if it doesn't interfere with your function, it's not a big deal. So if your spouse or significant other doesn't think it's a big deal, then it's probably not going to lead you to treatment. But if you end up being losing your job because you're on porn sites all day long at work, well, that's a big deal, right? There's a problem there. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface in understanding some of these things. But I would almost guarantee you that it's all the same pathways in the brain that's involved. The other thing that's interesting about that is, have you guys known anybody, ever known anybody that had like one addiction and then they quit? They were able to get treatment and they were able to give up that addiction, only to kind of fall down into losing your job because you're on porn sites all day long at work? Well, that's a big deal, right? There's a problem there. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface in understanding some of these things. But I would almost guarantee you that it's all the same pathways in the brain that's involved. The other thing that's interesting about that is, have you guys known anybody, ever known anybody that had like one addiction and then they quit? They were able to get treatment and they were able to give up that addiction, only to kind of fall down into another addiction, right? How common is that? Well, think about it, right? The brain is still wired. It's still not wired like it should be. So yeah, you gave up alcohol, but you went right over to benzodiazepines. So your Valium, now you're addicted to Valium instead of the alcohol. I mean, I'm not sure one's any better than the other. It's still an addiction, right? But, I remember having a lot of folks that would treat that would say that, hey, doc, I haven't drank in 15 years. Well, that's great. Well, I've been taking Valium, 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams a day for 15 years too. Well, unfortunately, I think you just basically substituted one addiction for another. But, hey, so I think you got to keep in mind that the cross addiction I'm sorry, that's not the right. Pat, help me out. What's that called? Is it cross addiction? Cross addiction? What's it called where you get substituted? Cross addiction, I think it is. I think it's what it's called. Anyway, put you on the spot, didn't I? There okay, so now, the next thing I want to do was spend some time talking about the different kind of classes of drugs of abuse. What do they do in the brain and what the symptoms are and all that. But before I do that, do you guys have any questions about all the stuff I just talked about? Is there any questions about the brain and how it's wired and all that? Does it make sense? Or did I just kind of lose everybody? Everybody's nodding their heads. Okay, it makes sense. Good. I'm glad. You guys, I'm going to present this stuff pretty simplistically because that's the way I think. I'm kind of simple. I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, on the dopamine, if you could get too much, you said it was difficult to just not be able to correct the amount of dopamine. Is there treatments that they attempt to do that? Or is that just not possible?
No, there are some treatments that they try to use, like for instance the Wellbutrin issue. That's a drug that boosts two chemicals in the brain, but dopamine is one of them. And the idea there is that if you can do that with a medicine that's non-addictive, then maybe that will substitute somehow, or maybe like for smoking, the idea is that they won't crave the cigarettes as much. And that's what happens. I mean, they don't, even if they continue to smoke, they usually smoke a little less.
So is that the only thing that they use dopamine for? Is like the Wellbutrin for smoking? I mean, with other addictions or other?
As far as I know, there is not. There's probably research, I'm sure, going on. I'm not up to date on all of that and all the different places around the world that are doing research. But there are. But as far as I know, of anything that's approved right now for use in addictions, this for the Wellbutrin is the only one that I know of that works on dopamine. The rest of them have another sort of a unique, different way of acting. Like Revia is one for alcohol use, and I think I'm not sure if it's indicated, but it can also be used for opiates and things. And these folks don't crave the opiates or the alcohol as much. And when they've done studies showing that with Revia, folks when they do relapse on alcohol, they don't drink as heavy as they did before. And there might be some benefit to that, but ideally we'd like to use something that where they wouldn't need. We don't want to get them addicted to something else. That's the other issue. I think that's the other problem is, some of these things you might stimulate dopamine, but then they get addicted to whatever it is you're giving them. So it's kind of hard to do. It's hard. It's a normal part of the brain, and it's just not working right. So you can't take it completely away, or then these folks, if you block the reward center completely, then they wouldn't want to eat. They wouldn't want to do things that are human.
So if it's a damage to the brain in some manner, has there been enough studies? I'm sure there have been, but studies that go back to maybe they've been preemies or different issues during delivery and whatever.
I don't want you to think of it as we don't know for sure to answer that question.
It's not the perfect balance, I'm saying.
Yeah, and it's not. You remember what I said about the monkeys now? These are folks. The brain is constantly changing. Okay, so in response to its environment. So remember the monkey study, right? These were monkeys that they didn't have any brain damage that we know of. Their births were normal and all that. Didn't have any brain damage, but it was the environment that sort of caused the brain to downregulate or something to happen. It wasn't permanent.
Balance is probably a better word, right?
Yeah, I think.
That perfect balance, it sounds like we're in the perfect world of the perfect
person.
Yeah,
I don't know what perfect is, but I don't know what perfect is, but I guess the way I think about it is all of us are going to have some stress, so you can't completely take all the stress out of somebody's life. But if somebody has a lot of ongoing stress, we know that that's not good for the brain. And this is just one way, by the way. There's other parts, the stress response system in the brain, which we'll talk about, and actually maybe next time or the time after, we're going to talk a little bit about that and about some of the studies that have shown that early childhood trauma can set a person up for depression and anxiety in adult life because of the stress response system. And basically, the brain, as a child, your brain is molding itself to its environment as you're growing up. And if that environment's not so good, you're potentially permanently changing the way that brain develops, and then setting that person up at risk for different things as an adult. So this is just one, addictions, but depression, anxiety, incidentally, those things they run together. So folks with depression have a lot higher incidence of using drugs and alcohol. This might be why, right? Because maybe they had a similar sort of stress and trauma growing up, and it not only affected the reward center in these parts of the brain that we're talking about tonight, but also the stress response system in the brain. And so this is why maybe a lot of people that have addictions also have depression, anxiety, or vice versa. Folks that have depression, anxiety also have addictions. It's good questions. I think some of it we know something about, and some of it we don't. But good anyway. Anybody else? Okay, so I was talking about how I tend to think of the drugs of abuse. The different. We put them into classes, right? So, and one simple way to do it is, what are things that stimulate or excite the brain? Okay, and then what are things that sort of calm the brain or downers, so to speak, I guess, and uppers, I suppose. That's the easy way to put it. But let's talk, I guess, first about the stimulating things. Anybody know what stimulates the brain? I mentioned one or two already a lot. What kind of drugs stimulate the brain? You guys know? Drugs of abuse now, that you get on the streets. Cocaine, right? Cocaine's one. We talked about that. Huh? Methamphetamine, excellent. And different types of amphetamine. There's Ritalin and dexedrine and things like that. Those are things that stimulate the brain. Ecstasy has some degree of stimulating effect, but also things like caffeine and ephedrine or pseudoephedrine. Ephedrine, was I think in many things, if I'm not mistaken, and then pseudoephedrine's in all the cold pills and things, and now that's been moved behind the counter. But those things are all sort of stimulating in the brain. Now, what does that do? What is that? When somebody takes something like that, think about for a second, what does it mean to excite the brain? Well, these folks get a lot of energy, and I think for a second too, if you guys have known folks that have taken too much caffeine or they've taken too much of some drug or something, and what do? They get euphoric, meaning that their mood is really good all the time. They don't need to sleep as much, right? They lose weight. In the old days, folks used to abuse Ritalin and dexedrine and stuff for weight loss.